Well, welcome to our first TOG chat in a while. Hello, Laurel.
Hi, Bob.
Welcome. So I'm Robert Osborne, and I'm joined by my colleague Laurel McCombs. And so we're here for a TOG chat. For a while there, we were doing Ask Me Anything, and I think we just decided to move back to this format. Although in the future, I think we're gonna open it up to an audience and still have some opportunity to ask questions. But today we're gonna do our first one that we've done in a while, just Laurel and I, without any external pressure. So we thought we would talk about strategic planning, right, Laurel?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we both. So I think there's been a real uptick in strategic planning. I think we are doing way more strategic planning than we ever did before. I mean, I have my own theories about it, but what do you think? What do you think the rise in strategic planning over the last year or two has been?
You know, I think there's a couple of things. I think the biggest one that I would point to is just coming out of the pandemic. I think there's a lot of organizations that we all had to pivot so quickly during the pandemic and change things so fast, and people kind of made decisions on the fly and got through it. And then now as we come out of it, I think folks are saying, okay, so we can breathe now. So how do we either get back to where we were, or how do we recognize that we're never going to look like we did before, but we have some choices around how we want to look moving forward. And I think there's some recognition that there are things in our sector that are never going to be the same again, and that requires us to make change. And so I that's probably the biggest thing I would point to in terms of why we're seeing this uptake. I don't know if you have any other thoughts around trends or in strategic planning.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I've been really happy that folks see the value in strategic planning. I think you and I both agree that it's really important, and having a strategic plan is actually not just pretty fundamental to running an organization well, but I would say it's pretty fundamental to fundraising, right? And successful fundraising, certainly on a major gift level, it's pretty fundamental. I think, after the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, I think there was a very different response. I think folks kind of just cut. They cut development staff. They just kind of felt like the way to weather the storm was just to cut budgets. And I think this time around, when there's a crisis, I think they've realized that, no, you really have to lean into these crises. You can't just kind of bury your head and cut budgets and hope for the best. You really have to think about, no, how am I going to proactively weather this storm? How am I going to proactively get through this crisis? And just as you said too, that even once the crisis goes away, I think we are living in a very different world, as you pointed out before, prior to March 2020. And I think, doing strategic planning is a fantastic way to really think about, well, what is this meant for us? And what is this, how do we move forward in a way that makes sense and that we're all on the same page? So yeah, I think it's that. And I think people learned lessons from the last crises, which is always nice to see.
Well, and I would point out that the biggest difference to me between the Great Recession of 07, 09 and the pandemic was, nobody came out of the Great Recession up dollar wise, right? Like everybody lost money. Everybody had to make cuts because giving went down. It was the first time in 50 years that giving actually went down, right? It was, there was no other option. A lot of folks came out of the pandemic up, right? Yeah. So, that was the difference with the pandemic, is we actually saw increases in giving in 2020 and 2021. We actually, and because the pandemic also came with federal assistance through, PPP grants and things like that, a lot of organizations didn't have to make cuts, even though they weren't delivering services, right? Because they were able to kind of come in with either federal assistance, or they had donors who were like, no, we want to keep you going, because this crisis was not tied to a financial recession. I think we saw organizations, and in some cases, a lot of folks that we're working with, Bob, who are really focused on social and racial justice, some of those organizations saw really big increases over the course of the pandemic, and are now looking to figure out how they capitalize on that, how they make sure that this investment that their donors have made in them are really making an impact. I also look at things, the impact of big donors like Mackenzie Scott and the influx of money she's had on the sector, and some of these other unrestricted gifts, big gifts that are coming into the sector right now. I think folks are feeling like, wow, we got through the pandemic and actually financially we're doing pretty well, but how do we not backslide, like how do we keep growing, and B, how do we make sure that as we go back and report on these investments and share with our community what we did with these investments, that we're demonstrating that we're having real impact. So I feel like that's kind of like the biggest shift between the recession and now.
So yeah, so well, you and I have both been up to our eyeballs in strategic planning. So what's your biggest takeaway so far? Like what have you what have we learned over the last couple of years in terms of what makes effective strategic planning, and yeah, like what's your biggest takeaway?
It's messy. It's not easy. I think that a lot of folks kind of just want to be able to say, to just walk in and be like, all right, here's our priority areas, here's what we want to achieve, done and done, right? But I think what I have found as you dive in with organizations, and you look at what has been happening and what do they want to accomplish, that things are complicated and things are messy, and some people agree and some people don't agree, and some people have certain priorities and other people are over here. And how do you and we're also in a time where staffing in the nonprofit sector is in a very different place than it's been, both in terms of the availability of staff, but also just in terms of, we're really leaving behind a culture of scarcity that we've lived in for a long time. And that's really impacting staff culture across the nonprofit sector. I mean, the cover story of last month's Chronicle of Philanthropy was about the unionization of the nonprofit sector, right? And you think about the impact that is having on strategic planning processes, as you have to think about staff as not just your fuel, but how are we fueling them, right? And
Right.
it's so I don't know, that's been my biggest broad takeaway is it's messy and it's hard, and it's hard to get everyone to really come up with those big outcomes that they want to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, it is messy, and from a consulting perspective, a lot of success definitely boils down to, as a consultant and facilitator, your ability to be nimble and to switch things up and to read the room and to read the process and make whatever changes you need to make. I guess something I've always believed in, but has really been hammered home for me over the last couple of years, is the need to kind of start the process with clarity of vision, like coming up with the shared outcomes. Like otherwise it's just a lot of arguing about, should we be doing this initiative or should we be doing that initiative? But I think if we can kind of think about like, well, what do we want to try to achieve? What are the outcomes that we're trying to get to? It's 5 years from now. What are we doing? That creates a framework for everybody to refer back to. And I think it also creates a group cohesion where everyone's narrow interests get subordinated to the larger group goal. And it's so worth spending whatever amount of time you need to spend in strategic planning on those shared outcomes. Because I've had groups where I think people very rightly have realized that their job is going to change radically or may not even exist in some way, that are still willing to, and happy participants in strategic planning, because they agree on the outcome and they agree that where they're going is what's necessary to serve their mission and serve the people that they serve. And we're not saying that they know, like no one's going to actively fire themselves, and obviously these organizations are trying to find ways to to transition people into different roles and use the people that they have. But I've just been really gratified that when there is that clarity of outcome, when we all agree like the world needs to look this way and here's how we're going to try to get there, that it makes it a lot easier for people to step out of their own more narrow interests and think about the organization and the communities that they serve and the clients that they serve. So for me, that's the thing. Again, it's not new, and anyone who's heard us talk has heard us talk about vision and having clarity around that all the time. But I think it's really brought home to me the need to have that as part of strategic planning in order to get everybody moving in the right spirit and in the right direction.
Absolutely. And I even think about, setting how important it is that we're setting that big vision during the strategic planning process, because it becomes so core to everything else we do in implementing the strategic plan, right? And you think about the role of big vision in our ability to fundraise big gifts, and the role of vision to inspire and motivate our board and our volunteers and our staff to do really big things. And it's just such an amazing tool to pull people out of, to your point, kind of the day-to-day, like do this, do that. If you have this North Star, if you have this, common impact and goal that everyone's shooting for, it kind of makes all of those little squabbles about, like, well, if I sell a table for the event, does that count toward my give get? Like, it makes all those little squabbles seem really silly, right? If we all realize where it is that we're ultimately trying to get with these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you and I also have noticed the other big trend, and you brought it up before, is really thinking about how equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging really fit into this. And for some groups, that's been very explicit and want real plans around that. And I think lots of other groups, it's one of the consideration. They want to really look at DEIB as as part of strategic planning, and really make sure that whatever they're doing, that's really baked in to the plan itself across the board. And I think prior to really 2020, I would say I hadn't really run into that. In fact, I think and I don't know if this happened to you, Laurel, but like the clients I was working with, I would kind of learn somewhere along the way that there was like a DEI consultant also working over here somewhere on things that absolutely impact development, usually the board, right? But there was no coordination between those things. Like, we have our DEI over here and we have our strategic planning over here, which says a lot, by the way, that's how it was being thought of, as to like this thing over here, and what does that have to do with how we actually do things over here. I don't think that was the intent, but I think that was maybe the reality of it, and where DEI was kind of left mostly to be, do you have enough BIPOC on your board, and kind of leave it at that. So I think that's another interesting trend around strategic planning that I've seen and am gratified about. And you and I are working on a variety. I mean, I think every strategic planning process we're working on at least has that as a consideration. And some, it's a very explicit goal of the strategic plan.
Well, and I think to your point about integration, right? I think even in some of the processes that I'm working through right now, there's been conversations about, is DEIB, DEI, whatever acronym your organization uses, is that kind of a focus area or a goal in and of itself, or is it this thing that is truly integrated across areas? And I think the folks who are thinking about this, who really want to integrate it are the ones who are saying, no, it's not its own siloed bucket of work. Even within our strategic plan, it is, in fact, if our buckets are, program and community engagement and fundraising and operations, DEI is something that is integrated across all of those areas and is, baked into every single thing that we're doing. And I think that's a really, to your point about, there was always maybe some DEI work happening somewhere, but it just wasn't being implicated. And, I think we've talked about this too. I think there was probably always some D work, some diversity work that was happening somewhere in the organization, maybe not the equity and the inclusion and belonging
E, I, or B.
that was happening. But then I think that's another big shift, is people are realizing that it isn't enough to just address diversity in their plans, but for any initiatives around diversity to be impactful and not performative, they have to include equity, inclusion, and belonging in them as well. So I think that's really exciting, is to see how that growth has happened as well.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing that I've noticed that I think is a positive change, and I think it's an important point around strategic planning, is the move to the 3 or 4 year strategic plan as opposed to the faux 1 or 2 year strategic plan, which are really just kind of operational plans. And I find that there's sometimes confusion between like what is strategic, what is big and forward thinking and long term versus what is more tactical and operational, and I think again that ties to vision and having like clarity about like what is something that's ambitious that we're trying to do well into the future, as opposed to what are the little tactical things that we're going to do that are, they just kind of pay the budget for the next year or two, which you need to do too. I mean, to be clear, you need those operational plans, but that's not what I think either one of us would consider a strategic plan. It's a plan, and we endorse planning of all kinds. Please plan, but to just to make that distinction between, like day-to-day operational stuff versus like what are some bigger goals that we have? What are the strategic things that we don't always have time to think about, that we kind of know we want to do, we kind of know are important, but the day-to-day kind of sucks us in. What are the big ambitions that might involve a 25% increase in the budget or in staffing or in the work that we do, like that kind of ambitious thinking, which again, I think it's hard to grow your budget without, on that scale, without the strategic plan. I'll see, that's the other thing I see less of now, is like a desire for like, well, we want to grow our budget by 25%, where we might get hired to kind of figure that out in the total absence of any sort of strategic plan to kind of anchor it. And so I think that's been a nice positive change in the sector as well, is like just the understanding of what strategic plans are and what strategic thinking is when it comes to running the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I was recently with a group who, I think the 3 to 5 years helps us to maybe also talk about the things that maybe feel scary, right? Like, or the things that we're interested in, but we still have a lot of questions about. And when we only take a 1 or 2 year approach to planning, we never make it a priority to get those questions answered. So we're kind of always coming back to ourselves and asking the same questions over and over again. Whereas if we take a 3 to 5 year view, we can put those things on the plate, right? The things that we're not sure if we're going to move forward with, but we sure are curious if we should, right? And those things can go in the plan, and the progress that needs to be made to answer the questions that need to be answered can be made, and those milestones put in place, right? To say go, no go, yes, no, right, on some of those things. And I think those are also the conversations that are really exciting for leaders of nonprofits, because that's the stuff that's not just status quo, not just growing incrementally, but really thinking about who could we be, what could we be doing in the future. I also think what I love is about this kind of 3 to 5 year time horizon is we're seeing less of the 10-year strategic plans, right?
Yeah,
that in a lot of ways feel just like nebulous and way too big, right? So there's this kind of sweet spot where it's far enough out that you get to have these kind of dreaming conversations, but not so far out that they feel unrealistic or you can't even picture what it would look like.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then, maybe the I know we've been talking for a little while now, maybe at least my final point is around the process itself. And, you and I talk about, very often in strategic planning, the process is the point, and it's not the separate thing, and how we, very often leadership within an organization or with leadership with the help of a consultant can go into a room, right, and come up with a plan that's going to be pretty good and be strong and strongly resemble the plan that is created over 6 months with a wider group of people, right? Like when we're really upfront about that with our clients, like, yep, you can probably sit down, three of you, and maybe one of us will come in too, and in an afternoon or maybe a day, we can come up with something that makes sense and is in line with the finances, and because most of the time organizations have, at least it's in their head, right? They've thought about this before, at least leadership has thought about it before. But a big part of the point of strategic planning is the buy-in to the strategic plan, right? Like how many strategic plans get created and nobody even knows they exist. They just sit on a shelf somewhere, or leadership knows they exist. They're never used. They're never referred to. Frontline staff have no idea that this is going on. They just, decrees kind of come down. And so that's an organization that's going to be less efficient. And so a lot of this is getting the buy-in of your stakeholders, on the front end. And by co-creating a plan together that, again, will be it will be a good plan. It will be very close to the plan that you might have come up with on your own as the executive director, as the board chair. But by virtue of including your staff, including your board, it's going to be much more likely to actually be used, to be bought into. And I think maybe even most importantly, your staff's going to know why they're doing the things that they're doing. And they're going to be more effective at it than they would if it just feels like, well, they told me to do this and then they told me to do that, and I'm doing it, but I don't really understand what the big picture is. So I think sometimes there isn't the appetite. Like certainly I've been on retreats, that lasted a weekend where we come up with a strategic plan. Then, 5 weeks later that I hear from the ED and they're doing something completely different. And, so I'm glad there's been a little bit of a move away too from like the idea of strategic planning as this one day retreat, or, 3 people on the board and the executive director go off and come up with a plan, and a move to a much more inclusive, process-oriented plan, which may feel slow, but I think you'll get so much more out of by really embracing an inclusive process with your staff.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, as we wrap up this, I think my biggest advice to anyone who is realizing they need a new strategic plan, or seeing that their existing strategic plan is going to expire next year, is like, don't wait to start thinking about this. I think the best strategic planning processes that we go through with folks, we've got a 9 to 12 month time horizon to do all the things, right? I think about the ability to do, organizational assessments to get a really solid view of current state, the ability to survey program participants, volunteers, wide varieties of stakeholders, potentially even doing focus groups with staff, really getting a lot of input on the front end that then you can analyze and come out with that strategic plan at the end, creating lots of space and time for that strategic planning process itself, the committee meetings, and everything just takes longer. And especially when we're working with board members who have like day jobs and other things that they have to do. And, if, don't wait till 3 months before you want to have a new strategic plan to start thinking about it. Start thinking about it a year ahead, and contact someone like us, or another group, or someone who who has some expertise around this, and start thinking about what that timeline looks like, and give yourself some space, because you'll come out with something that's actually useful if you do it that way.
Yeah. Well, we Laurel and I, we can keep talking, but I think we'll wrap it up for now. It's been good to do this TOG chat. We'll be doing them, I think, monthly or so. We'll do some with some audiences, and so we thanks, Laurel, and we look forward to seeing you all and doing another TOG chat in about a month or so.